bring John McMullen into the conversation as we're hanging out on a Monday. We'll talk some NFL. We'll also get John's – I definitely want to get John's take on the schmoz that happened yesterday over at the Wells Fargo Center there. John, I know we've had our differences on that Sixers topic, but I want to ask you this question at first. Are we really supposed to believe that Jerry Colangelo reclused himself from the process of bringing Bryan Colangelo to the 76ers?
Well, I don't think you should believe it. That's for sure. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the talk of 70 candidates and he was the best one. It's a lot of nonsense, but it's some of the spin you have to do. I think people are caught up in the nepotism, thinking that Bryan Colangelo doesn't have his own resume, which he does. So that part of it I don't have as big as an issue with. But the Sixers are a bad organization, and they've been a bad organization for a long time. So it's certainly not shocking by any stretch of the imagination that they handle things in an inept way.
I would, look, again, this whole thing has been an absolute mess from the letter to the resignation of Henke to the on-the-court product to where they are today, basically calling a press conference at 2:30 on the Sunday of the Masters and trying to sneak that in there of basically, hey, we just hired Bryan Colangelo, and Jerry Colangelo had nothing to do with it. It just has been a very bad week for an organization that already had a lot of perception problems, most of it coming with their on-the-court product.
Yeah, and I think it's evident, in the day where Ed Snyder passed away, if you think about him and how well respected he is for running the Flyers, but when Comcast sort of took over the 76ers, they were an afterthought in a lot of ways, and that's rare when you compare an NBA team to an NHL team. But that was the reality in Philadelphia. The Flyers were the bigger deal for that organization. The Sixers were the redheaded stepchild, so to speak. And when Josh Harris bought this team, I think a lot of people said, okay, now we got a guy who actually cares, who actually wants to be involved, wants to make the Sixers a winning organization. I think he does. But he's been a bad owner, and he's been even worse than Comcast was by a long stretch. And it hasn't changed, and it hasn't changed whether it's been Doug Collins and Ed Stefanski, whether it's been Sam Hinkie and Brett Brown, and now into the new regime of Jerry Colangelo, Bryan Colangelo, and whoever is moving this team forward. I think Brett will certainly start the season, but I wouldn't be surprised after a bad start that they move on from him as coach. It starts at the top, and Josh Harris isn't an NBA owner, isn't a sports owner. You should never stick a microphone in his face. He's just horrible in public situations, and you saw an example of that Sunday. But if you want some hope, I know that sounds bad, you saw Bryan has a lot of experience in that, and he sort of took control of the questions and tried to steer them in the right direction. So you're talking about a guy with a ton of experience running NBA teams. Granted, he's been out of the league for about 3 years, but two-time executive of the year. And that's what you got to hang your hat on.
Well, John, you just mentioned he's been out of the league for 3 years. Now, he's a two-time executive of the year. Like I said, it's not like he's a boob. The guy's not an idiot. This isn't more of they hired a dummy. It's just the way they went about it that was poor. And I think there's a lot of people that liked what the Sixers were where they were heading. Maybe not what they were doing, but where they were heading. Why was Bryan Colangelo not in the league? By the way, you just mentioned he hasn't been there for 3 years. He was an executive in Phoenix where, all right, everybody says that Jerry Colangelo doesn't answer to anybody and he's always in charge. So am I supposed to believe when he was in Phoenix running that team that he was really the be-all, end-all there too?
Well, I think it's a little different. I don't think you should because you're right, everybody's going to lean on Jerry Colangelo, but it's a little bit different because he is his son and he probably has a lot more trust in him than other people. So from that aspect, I think it's a little bit different, but You're right to question it, and it talks, as we said, it all goes back to the organization. As far as the Philadelphia 76ers and Josh Harris and Scott O'Neil, they have to answer for what just took place, and whatever side of the fence you're on, and we're on opposite sides of the fence. Either way, they need to explain themselves, and they certainly haven't done it well enough. And that part is legitimate to criticize them for.
Are you surprised? Are you surprised then that okay, this has been it's an embarrassment. They're this, they're that, the other thing. That a well-respected former executive of the year took this job.
Well, I think he won it back in the league, and that's something I was going to mention. Understand, a lot of people. And I know you've said this before, and I don't disagree with the fact that if you look at the Sixers as his general manager and you look at the assets that Sam Hinkie acquired, you might want to be in this situation to be able to manipulate that kind of thing. But by all accounts, Bryan Colangelo didn't want this job. He wanted the Brooklyn Nets job. That's what he wanted to be in, which is certainly not in as nearly as good as his shape in theory, at least for years down the line, but it speaks to what I've talked about for months and months and months about how dysfunctional and how people look on this brand of the Philadelphia 76ers. There's not a lot of people that want to get involved with Josh Harris and Scott O'Neil.
Yet somebody as well-respected as Jerry Colangelo and Bryan Colangelo were willing to do it. That's what smells to me.
Well, that part comes in. That's where Adam Silver comes in. I don't think there's any chance that Jerry Colangelo comes to Philadelphia for the months he did. And remember that the secondary story of this is that he stepped down.
Yeah, well, and I was gonna get to that. I'm getting to that. Don't worry.
Yeah. Remember, he took this job at the behest of the NBA commissioner, who asked him to do a favor.
Allegedly.
And that's allegedly, but it's certainly not one report here and there. It's been said and substantiated again and again and again. That's why he stepped into this situation as a favor to the NBA and Adam Silver. Why Bryan Colangelo stepped in? If he didn't have any other options and this was it, and he wants to get his foot back in the door, we can only speculate. Or he could be excited. He could be excited about getting another draft choice and trying to get the right pieces among certain young players to finally get them sort of developing and heading in the right direction.
So if Hinkie doesn't quit, which Bryan said he was disappointed that was never the case. Now, they never really answered the question of, was Bryan going to answer to Sam? Was Sam going to answer to Bryan? How was that going to work? They never really answered that question. By the way, we're talking to John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. John covered the NBA for a long time. Would the father have resigned? If Sam Hinkie didn't quit, if Sam Hinkie doesn't quit, does Jerry Colangelo walk out the door?
Well, I don't think that was I think if Sam Hinkie doesn't quit, he's the director of analytics. No matter what the title says, he was going to answer to Bryan Colangelo and Jerry Colangelo. But yes, if by some strange stretch of fate that Josh Harris woke up and said, you know what, I trust Sam more than Jerry now. Yeah, Jerry would have walked away and Bryan wouldn't have come. It's the reason Sam Hinkie resigned. And that's what's so laughable about Josh Harris saying he was shocked. You can't, even somebody who's been as critical as me as Sam Hinkie, you can't be surprised if you continually neuter somebody that you brought in to run your basketball operations. You already did it once with Jerry Colangelo. Now there was going to be another Colangelo between him and Josh Harris in power. It's no surprise that Sam Hinkie walked away and resigned, and for Josh Harris to claim he was stunned by that or shocked is ludicrous.
So why does Jerry Colangelo step down? Well, I mean, it looks ridiculous, doesn't it? They bring him on. He's an advisor to the ownership group. So the guy that you gave a 3-year deal to be an advisor, John, to the ownership group, didn't advise you on the GM. That's what we're supposed to believe. when they hired Bryan Colangelo to be the president, the guy that you gave a 3-year deal to advise reclused himself from that? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, no, it doesn't. If you believe that, you're going to probably buy the Brooklyn Bridge a week from now. I mean, you're naive. And obviously that's what he was brought in here. He's a 76-year-old man who lives in Phoenix. We talked about it from day one. It didn't make a lot of sense. He obviously wasn't going to be here long term. He was brought in here to stabilize the franchise and bring in the new steward of the organization. Once they found that steward, who happened to be his son.
You get a 3-year deal for that.
Yeah, I mean, he is going to be an advisor. There's no question about that. And he's a good
just like
advisor.
Doug Collins. Is Doug Collins still an advisor? Is he still on the payroll?
Well, I understand. I understand the frustration. I mean, it's handled horribly, and when you're trying to just spin it as anything other than nepotism, which I said last week when we talked about this, by definition, it's nepotism. Nobody can claim it isn't. But all that said, again, it is a guy with a resume. It's not like the legendary basketball mind with the 28-year-old son who flamed out in a minor league basketball league who never had any experience, and he just handed him the keys to the castle. This isn't Chip Kelly with no experience in this position. This guy has a ton of experience, and he has learned from one of the greats, because one of the greats is his father.
John McMullen's with us, talking a little NBA with John, and we'll also get some NFL thoughts in. John, you covered the league. How many years did you cover the NBA?
8. I was the national editor at Sports Network, but for many years I covered the Timberwolves when I was out in Minnesota, when I covered the Vikings. So probably 10 to 12 years.
So you've been around the league for a long, long time. Where would you put this Golden State story? I mean, is this a prominent NBA story? I mean, they're gonna break, most likely, break the record of the Bulls, who many people, Jordan's attached to that Bulls team, so they are the greatest team ever. Where does this team rank with where they might finish?
It's certainly a big story, and anytime you break a record like that, I think if you talk to NBA people, especially old school NBA people, they never regarded that Bulls team, even though they had the record for wins, as the greatest of all time. They go back to the Russell Celtics, even the 66-67 Sixers, who were voted the greatest team of all time when they did the 35th anniversary. Teams like that, because they were so deep and there wasn't expansion and there were just Hall of Famers up and down the rosters. Even though the Sixers only got to 67 wins, I think, something in that range, and 69 wins for the Lakers with Wilt Chamberlain. Those were truly, truly great teams, and I think people look upon them as a little bit better than the new school simply because of the depth. But anytime you break that record, it's a huge story. For the Golden State Warriors, though, it's only about one thing, and it's about winning back-to-back championships. So
if they win back-to-back champions, if they win back-to-back championships with 9 losses on the season, then what's the narrative?
Well, that's one of the great teams of all time. There's no question about it. But what I was saying is if they happen to lose to the Spurs in the playoffs, for instance, all of a sudden that record means nothing. So while any great team, success in the regular season is very important to them because they're generally very, very competitive, and they want to win every time they step out on the court. But all of a sudden, if you don't win the title, it just means so much less. So in a lot of ways, it just puts that much more pressure on this group of Golden State Warriors.
John McMullen's with us, 97.3 ESPN, and, of course, a lot of basketball stuff. The playoffs begin this weekend. You'll hear the playoffs right here on 97.3 ESPN. And, one thing, we flip over to some football now. We talked a little bit about LaShawn McCoy and that situation. It looks like the league's not going to step in here, John. Are you surprised that the league backed out of this one?
Not completely surprised. It wouldn't have shocked me either way. if they knocked him for suspension or if they walked away. There's been so much controversy with Roger Goodell and personal conduct issues. It's almost like the fact if the legal process doesn't want to move forward against you, he kind of washes his hands because he doesn't want the headache. And I think that's what kind of happened with Shady McCoy. The league certainly could have taken a look at it and could have acted, but all of a sudden, as we see, no matter what decision Roger Goodell makes and what controversy, one side or the other is highly critical of it. And I think when the league can err on the side of caution and just stay out of it, I think that's their strategy to do right now.
All right, John. Obviously, so many things getting ready for this NFL draft, and that's really the view of a lot of things. But one of the things, ESPN.com ranked some of the top moves in this offseason. They look very favorably at the Eagles locking up some of their own players, really kind of giving this team somewhat of an identity. But as you have a piece up at 97.3 ESPN.com, a lot of those guys were on this team that Byron Maxwell said wasn't a very good team in 2015. And I guess is that more of the narrative of Chip Kelly and just the mess that this was, or is that looking at the talent on that team saying we didn't have very good talent?
Well, I think the talent took a hit largely because of Kelly walking away, and we know all the names. We talk about them again and again and again. So anytime you lose players like Deshaun Jackson and Ron McCoy and Jeremy Maclin and Evan Mathis and on, and you don't replace them, well, you're not nearly as good. And that's what happened to the Eagles. Now, that said, from Philadelphia's perspective, they'll say, well, we might need to rebuild at certain positions, and they certainly need to add talent to this team. But we will be better because we have a better staff in place. We have a better structure where people communicate. And if that turns out to be true, I think, there is a chance for this team to be slightly better. As I look at it today, it's not going to be a dominant team that's challenging for the top of the NFC or anything of that nature. But in the bad NFC East, remember, they were in it to almost the end last season again, just because of how bad the division was. You pick up a win here and there, and you're right back at the top. And I think that's a possibility because this division, again, is shaping up as one of the worst in the NFL.
John, I do want to ask you also about your piece on D'Brickashaw Ferguson, who basically, here's a guy who's never missed really a snap. He's been a rock and just decided to retire. A little bit of a surprise move. That happened on Friday. You had some insight on that over at today's pigskin.com. What do you make of that decision by D'Brickashaw Ferguson?
Well, he had a big cap number, $14 million, and the Jets, before he retired, were $500,000. That's all they had under the salary cap to move forward. And obviously that's even enough to sign your rookie class, never mind your quarterback, Ryan Fitzpatrick. So they were going to have to need to create space, and the logical place to start was D'Brickashaw Ferguson. He kind of knew it was coming. He was contemplating this. And the GM there finally came to him in the weight room and said, look, we're going to have to redo your deal. He wanted to cut his number basically in half. His salary was over $10 million. And D'Brickashaw said, basically, as what you said, he's played a decade with that team and missed one snap. And that wasn't because of injury. That was because of the trick play. He's never missed a practice. And he just decided to himself, I'm not going to play unless I get my full salary. And from that perspective, I don't really blame him because he's a guy who's earned it. And remember, if he forces the Jets' hand and forces them to cut him, yeah, he could get a job tomorrow. But again, it's going to be at a significantly less salary cap number. And he didn't want to play for that.
It's a good read, today's pigskin.com, D'Brickashaw Ferguson. When I hear that name, I remember when his draft class came out, he was like, he was going to be the next great offensive tackle. He was the surefire, can't miss, best guy in that draft. And he was a pretty good player. I don't know if he turned out to be a Hall of Fame level player, but another interesting story of a guy walking out And you know what? I'm out. This is it. And we're seeing more and more of that. And as you wrote a piece about Bruce Arians, too, saying he should have stood his ground, which maybe he should. I was having this conversation the other day with a couple of women, actually. It's kind of funny. And I was saying, we don't want our kids playing football. And I'm thinking to myself, your son's not playing in the NFL. You do know that, right? I mean, if they play JV, varsity, high school football, I think you're going to make it through life okay. Let them be kids and still have fun. It's the guys that are playing at a high college and pro level that might have some problems down the line, but they can still be kids playing a great game.
Yeah, and I've had this discussion with people too, and the demarcation line is really interesting because you're right, especially youth football. Anybody who's been around it, anybody who's played it, anybody who's had nephews or kids or family play it, no, there's not enough. They don't have enough physicality yet to hurt each other. They're just out there running around having fun. But then as you get towards the high school level, and especially the lower college level, where guys are strong enough to hurt each other and there's impactful hits, that's the biggest concern. Because if you think about it, high school games around the country, unless you're in Texas, where they have some NFL-level stadiums, or lower-level colleges, they don't have the medical personnel on hand to handle things that happen on game day. The NFL, I mean, you see what they do on a week-to-week basis if they think and all the policies they put in place. And a lot of reasons is it was forced. There's no question about it. But whether it was forced or not doesn't really matter at the end of the day. The improvements have been made. It's a much safer game. And I think what Bruce Arians was trying to say is, let's get people educated. He wasn't woman bashing. He was just saying if you automatically assume that this sport is going to cripple your child for life, you're wrong. And you need to get more educated. And I don't think that's a bad thing to be advocating.
All right, John's got an interesting article up on our website from Byron Maxwell's perspective on the season, plus the Eagles' comments on the passing of Ed Snyder. That's all over at 97.3 ESPN.com. All right, John, we'll talk to you tomorrow, pal.
Hey, thanks, Mike.